anything else we need to announce or anything? So, with that, well, we have a word of prayer and we'll get going. Father, you know everything. We're here as players trying to understand what's going on. We ask that you be with Steve on Tuesday as he undergoes surgery. You know, this is a great worry to Lord. Be with Roy and hopefully keep his spirits up. Hope it'll be an encouragement. This class can be a blessing to both of them. And be with Roy as he has this lesson, continues to have this lesson each week with Steve. Be with Doug this morning. And each week, we will learn so much about Jesus in this class. And hopefully today will be another one of those great days. So we ask these things.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. I did not do a sound check and a light check earlier. Abner, are we coming through okay with sound and the lighting is all good and everything? Good,
Great.
good. Well, good to be with you. And John Cosgrove, thank you for the excellent lesson last week. And the baptism, the temptations of Jesus are the story that come just before what we're going to look at now. And you might remember that the week before that, we were talking about John the Baptist. We're back to John the Baptist. John the Baptist is going to drop out of the story for all practical purposes in just a little bit, but he plays pretty big in these early stories of Jesus. And we come to him again today, and next week we'll be seeing him a little bit more, and then he won't show up for a little while. But John the Baptist was a big deal. I think we've talked about that before, not just in who he was and the sort of kind of wild man that he was. We even gave him the nickname of, well, Keith, you started off with Bulldog, and I suggested we move to Bulldozer because that really fits his prophetic mission. He was bulldozing the path ahead of Jesus, getting ready for Jesus. And today we're going to take another look at this wild, crazy bulldozer man of God, who in many ways was so like Jesus and in other ways so different than Jesus, but they both were working for the same purpose. And we noted in passing that one of the things that almost in passing that we ought to note about this is how different people, such different personalities, different temperaments, different backgrounds, can be focused on the same thing and not have to be the same people. And I think that's a good thing to know. It's a good thing in this class for us to appreciate the very different views that we sometimes have, the different perspectives, who we are as different people, but we can all be focused on Jesus. And that's a great thing to notice in passing. It's not our main point today. So let me tell you what our main point is and what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to be looking today at a man who knew who he was. A man who knew what he was and was not jerked around by what everybody else thought he was or what they thought he should be doing or being. I want you to really stop and think about that for a second. A man who knew who he was and was not jerked around by everything that everybody else expected or thought. Now, of course, that could describe Jesus perfectly, and we're going to see many instances in Jesus' life where that describes him well. But in this lesson, we're looking specifically at John the Baptist, and we're seeing that as a man who knew who he was. He is very much like Jesus in that way, who knew who he was and what he was all about, and was not jerked around by what everybody else thought or expected. So that's going to be the focus of our lesson today. And the question I want to start off with is this. Can you remember a time when somebody said to you, "Who do you think you are?" Maybe not with that tone of voice. Maybe they said, "Who do you think you are?" Or maybe a tone of voice more like, "Who do you think you are?" It could come in all different tones. Can you think of a time? I'm not going to ask for your stories, but I would like for you to see if you can conjure up a story in your head of a time when somebody asked you, who do you think you are? I'll give you a second to think of that. Can you remember a time when somebody asked you a question or something that sounded kind of like that? I'm curious, how many of you have thought of a story? A couple of you? Okay. So if you've not thought of a story, keep thinking, but especially for those of you who have thought of a story, here's my follow-up question. And this is one that I do want you to say something out loud about. When the person asked that question of you, probably they knew who you were, at least at some level. You know, probably not a total stranger. Now, maybe it was a total stranger, and yet they were not asking because they wanted to see your driver's license. They were asking for some other reason. And my question is this: what was behind the question? What was their motive? Why were they asking that question of you? What was driving that question? And I want to hear just brief one-word answers. Oh, good, Ken. Let's hear yours.
Generally, it's because you're invading their turf, or you're getting too.
Okay. Because you're invading their turf. And I missed the last part of what you said, Ken. You said that you're invading their turf, and what else?
Well, you're getting too close. They're uncomfortable.
Yeah. They're wanting you to back off. Yeah. Okay. Somebody else. Great. Somebody else. Yes, please.
You've said something or stand for something they disagree with, and they're asking you to justify how you could dare have that opinion because your opinion doesn't count.
Whoa. How dare you? You don't count. Yeah. Somebody else. Good. Somebody else. I want to hear from one or two more. Maybe somebody online. What was behind it when somebody asked you that?
Jealousy.
Jealousy. Okay. Could be jealousy. One more.
Belittle you.
To belittle you. Yeah. Usually when somebody asks you, who do you think you are? It's not a compliment. It's not an invitation to let's get to know each other, right? So let me tell you my who do you think you are story. Yes, please, one more.
I just think about, hey, it's Tiffany. I just think about being blissfully ignorant and someone shedding light on your ignorance by that question.
Oh, okay. Okay, so very different. Tiffany, right?
Yes.
Okay. So Tiffany, say just a word more about that, because I'm intrigued. Your answer is tickling my curiosity here.
Well, I think about the story that I have. I think I probably had a false sense of confidence about the matter, at hand. And so it was, when I was asked that, it was kind of shedding light to my ignorance. That maybe I had a, inflated ego about that came up. So for me, that's what I think about is,
Yeah. Thank you, Tiffany. I wondered if maybe that's where you were going. I didn't want to assume that, but I wondered if that's where you were going. And that's a really good take on this too. It's another take on it. And that is there's sometimes when we may need to be asked that question. And we may need to stop and think, are we really full of ourselves and arrogant and trying to push our weight around? So good comments. Thank you. Let me tell you my who do you think you are story, because it will, I think, lead nicely into the story we're going to read of John the Baptist here. And all the comments that you've made have helped us lead into that too. I thank you for them. It was in 1979. Lorraine and I had just gotten married right out of college. I was young and green, 23 years old, and in my first pastoral position in the little town of Florence, Mississippi. If you don't know where Florence is, it's just a little south of Jackson, Mississippi. And Lorraine and I were doing essentially the sort of work that Mormon missionaries do. Yesterday, I ran into a couple of Mormon missionaries, and it always amuses me to see these young guys who are, barely out of high school, and their name badge reads Elder Smith, Elder Johnson. And I ran into a couple of Mormon missionaries yesterday when I was out walking my dog, and a big, friendly, gentle dog always is a good conversation starter. So I stood and talked with these guys for a few minutes, and how long they'd been in Walla Walla and where they were from, and a nice conversation with them. And they had an appointment to get to, a Bible study appointment to get to. So we didn't talk long, they were off on their way. But I asked them, how's it been with COVID? How's that affected your work? And they said, well, we couldn't do door to door anymore. We did a lot of stuff by phone and Facebook and so forth. And I said, but you're back to door now? And they said, yeah. And I couldn't help but think, when I was about that age myself, young, green, newly married, first year in pastoral ministry, and Lorraine and I went north of Jackson because there was another contact up there that we were following up, somebody who was interested in studying the Bible. But it was a good hour's drive from Jackson. It was north of Jackson, up in Canton, Mississippi. And because we had to drive so far up there, we said, we might as well make use of our time while we're up here and make a day of it. And so we said, we probably ought to find a few other people to study the Bible with up here. And so literally we did what Mormon missionaries do. We began knocking on doors. And Lorraine and I knocked on dozens and dozens of doors and introduced ourselves with a very civil introduction. We said, hi, we're Christian workers. We like to study the Bible with people. Would you like to study the Bible? I mean, that's about as direct as you can get, right? And we picked up a few Bible studies, people who wanted to study the Bible. Well, one of the women who we began studying the Bible with, we had an idea that she was in an abusive marriage and a situation of domestic violence. And here we got tangled up in the middle of that. It's a long story, but I will just tell this much of it. One morning, we got a phone call from her that she was making from a phone booth at probably the only gas station in Canton, Mississippi. And she said, my husband has just thrown me out of the house and threw all my stuff out with me, and I'm here and I don't know where to go. And so we drove up to Canton, and there she was, sure enough, her clothes, not even in garbage bags, heaped on the side of the road, and just this heap of her stuff, and her by the phone booth there, shaken and afraid and confused and not knowing what to do and where to go. And we loaded all of her stuff into our car and tried to figure out what we were going to do next. And I'll have to admit, like I said, we were young and green, and I would do a thing or two differently these days if I were in the same situation. But we found an elderly couple in the church that was willing to have her stay with them for who knows how long, until we figured out what happened next. Well, to make a long story short, it wasn't that long before we realized that her abusive husband was concocting a story of kidnap. And we were the kidnappers. And this thing just got more and more bizarre. And we got some threatening phone calls. Middle of the night, the phone would ring, and I would hear heavy breathing on the other end, but no speaking, and then click. I mean, this was just, it was a bizarre incident. And here we are, a couple of college kids, just barely out of college, and nothing in my pastoral ministry classes had prepared me for this, and we didn't have a social worker in the church that I could go to for advice, and we were just kind of winging it. And long story short, a day or so later, so this has gone on less than a week, but a day or so later, we get a call from the sheriff. Now, I happened to, one of the Bible studies that we started up there in Canton was, of all places, in the jail. And think Andy Griffith, Mayberry, and where the sheriff's office and the jail are all together. That was what Canton, Mississippi had. So we knew where the jail was. We knew where the sheriff's office, because we were there every week for a Bible study. And the sheriff calls and says, "Get that girl up here." So anyway, lots to this story that I'm not telling. I'm making this story too long anyway, as it is. So we went over and got her from this elderly couple's home, loaded her stuff up. This time, I think we at least put it in garbage bags. And we drove up there. Well, I don't know why, but as it turned out, the time that we drove her up there was late at night. I think it was 9, 10 o'clock. I say late. It was dark. And we got to the little jailhouse, the sheriff's office, and there's a few steps going up. It was not on the parking lot level. And Lorraine stayed in the car, and I got out of the car and was unloading this woman's stuff and noticed 2 sheriffs standing cross-armed up on the top of the steps, and a man that I didn't know or recognize standing between them. I learned later that this was her husband, and he was a big guy. You know, I was 6 feet, but I think I weighed about 120 pounds at the time. So I was this, bean pole. And this guy is taller than me. I'd say he was probably 6'5" and probably weighed 2 or 3 times my weight. I mean, he was a big guy. And he's standing between the sheriffs and glowering at us. And I think I kind of figured at the time, well, this might be her husband. And so we get her stuff out. And I don't know what to do. I mean, this is a strange situation. Like I said, nothing in my classes had ever prepared me to know how to handle a situation like this. And so I don't know if one of the sheriffs jerked his head at me or just what, but I walked up the steps and I was standing a step or 2 below this big guy, the woman's husband, and he's glowering down at me. And you might know where this story is going, because the question he asked me was, "Who do you think you are?" Well, in that moment, how was I to answer that question? Well, he didn't give me a lot of time, because the next thing I know, this huge fist that seemed, as it came toward me, the size of a cantaloupe, plowed into the side of my head, and I stumbled backwards and fell down the steps. And here's this, young kid from California that has heard all these things about, the South and law enforcement in the South and so forth. And every bit of those things seems to be coming true in this moment, because instead of the 2 sheriffs standing on either side of this guy, putting him in handcuffs or telling him that this is assault or, trying to contain him or something, they look at me and they say, "Now get." And I got in my car and we began driving, and I looked at Lori and I said, "What just happened?" Well, my mother, I haven't seen her. She's, I think, somewhere on this call, but she always tells me that preachers never finish their stories. They always leave people hanging. That's as far as I'm going to go with the story. If you're interested in the rest of the story, I can tell you another time. But that was my experience of somebody asking me, "Who do you think you are?" And there's some similarities, maybe you'll see them as we read the story of John the Baptist, with some authorities, big authorities, coming to him and asking him, "Who do you think you are?" Open your harmonies to the article number 26. If you don't have a harmony, do we have some extra copies for people?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so raise your hand if you need a harmony of the gospel. This one is easy if you don't have a harmony, because it's all found in the book of John. Oh, we need one in the back, it looks like. But this one is easy, but it's nice to use the harmony here, because as you know, the harmony puts the gospel accounts side by side. So you see what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say on the same story. This one happens to be only told by John. And as we're going to learn as we go through the stories later, John was an eyewitness, because John, who became a follower of Jesus, was first a follower of John the Baptist. And he was very likely an eyewitness to this. And he's going to show up in next week's story as one of John's disciples that starts following Jesus. But here we are with this story that focuses on John the Baptist and people asking him, who do you think you are? And it was the bigwigs from Jerusalem. So let's read the story here. It's article number 26. And it's in John 1, if you are happening to use a Bible that is not divided up the way that the Harmony is edited. It's John 1 and starting with verse 19. Now this was John's testimony. When the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was, he did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, I am not the Christ. They asked him, then who are you? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. Are you the prophet? He answered, no. Finally, they said, who are you? Give us an answer to take back to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? John replied in the words of Isaiah the prophet, I am the voice of one calling in the desert, make straight the way for the Lord. Now some Pharisees who had been sent questioned him, why then do you baptize if you are not the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet? I baptize with water, John replied, but among you stands one you do not know. He is the one who comes after me, the thongs of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. This all happened at Bethany on the other side of Jordan, where John was baptizing. The next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, look, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. This is the one I meant when I said, a man who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. I myself did not know him, but the reason I came baptizing with water was that he might be revealed to Israel. Then John gave this testimony. I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him. I would not have known him except that the one who sent me to baptize with water told me, the man on whom you see the Spirit come down and remain is the one who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. I have seen and I testify that this is the Son of God. Now, as always, that's a rich, powerful story with lots and lots for us to explore. And the angle that we're taking on it today, the one lens through which we're going to look is the beginning part of the story. And then we're going to see how the end of the story ties in with that. But the lens through which we're looking is this lens of who do you think you are? And that's the first half of the story here. So my question is this. When these priests and Levites came from Jerusalem to ask John the Baptist, who do you think you are? What do you think was motivating them? Why were they asking that question? Let me hear from some of you. Please, John.
Okay, they were asking for his credentials because he had not been taught in their schools. But if he were a prophet sent directly from God, then he was allowed to teach. And they were wanting him to prove his credentials so that they could either approve him or censor him.
Yeah, thank you. So much like some of the comments that you made earlier, they had a motive, almost like what Ken started us off with. You're getting on our turf. And if we can't verify you, you better back off. Is that fair to say, John?
Yes.
Yeah. Somebody else. What's
Douglas?
behind this question? Yes, Mother.
I think there may have been some jealousy involved here.
Mm-hmm.
They were jealous of his popularity. I mean, just think of how far out from Jerusalem he was. It was not an easy thing for people to get there, and yet they were going. And, and so I think there was some jealousy there, and the fear of them losing control of the people. A lot involved in that. They were looking for a way to discredit him, maybe.
Good, and we've got a hand on the, thank you, Mother. We've got a hand on the front row, but let me just make this follow-up comment. For those of you who don't know how far it was, if you look on a map of Israel, you'll see that Jerusalem is just north and west of the Dead Sea. That's where you'll find Jerusalem. And the Jordan River flows from the Sea of Galilee straight south down into the Dead Sea. And John is on the far side of the Jordan River. That is, he's on the opposite side from Jerusalem. Well, the closest that he could have been to Jerusalem was about 20 miles, depending on where you are on the Jordan River, because the Jordan River is about 20 miles east of Jerusalem. And it's desert in that area, and it's rough roads. And he's out there at the Jordan River preaching and baptizing, and crowds, huge crowds, are going out, walking 20 miles to hear him. It's not like he's down the street in Jerusalem preaching on the street corner. He is 20 miles out in the desert. And that is impressive. And no wonder the Jerusalem religious leaders were a little bit concerned that mobs were going out there to hear him. Who is this guy? What are his credentials? So yeah, that distance does make a difference. It does add to the story. Let's come to the comment on the front row there. I didn't see who it was, but I did see a hand.
Sure. This is Ryan Harold. I think we know each other. But yeah,
hi, Ryan.
I think what we see here is the start of a pattern in the Jerusalem leadership that continues on through Christ's ministry, right? It's so much of the reaction of the power structure at the time was in a result of their fear of losing their power over the people.
Yes.
So much of their opinion of themselves was derived from their status. They had attached so much meaning to their status and power and control over the people that they saw John and Christ following that as a threat to their ability to maintain their power and influence and wealth in their community. So I think that they saw anything that drew the people away from them as a threat to their existing power structure and power dynamics of the political environment today.
Yep. So true. Thank you, Ryan. Great comment. And like you said at the beginning of your comment, this really becomes a pattern for how they're going to treat Jesus. I mean, this is going to take us all the way to the cross. Think of on the cross how the religious leaders are in such undignified ways taunting Jesus, mocking him, almost like little kids gloating. And it's the same spirit here. It just gets worse and worse over the next few years. So yeah, this is the beginning of a long-standing jealousy, hatred. It's going to end in murder. And we see it starting with John the Baptist. Good point. Anybody else? What's behind this question? Who do you think you are? Please, Rod.
One of the kind of follow-up to his comment, which was, I think, spot on, the Pharisees were preaching to the people who the Messiah was going to be and what his characteristics were going to be, the power he was going to have. Of course, they were going to be his lieutenants. And when this Messiah came along that they didn't even know who it was, that threatened them greatly too, because the Messiah was totally different than what they were proselytizing.
Right. And Rod, you'll notice, I think this is probably what you're thinking of, is that his first answer to them, he says, I'm not the Christ, which clearly implies that some people thought he was. And so he has to stop that rumor right at the, you've got to cut that one off at the knees. Ken.
Well, actually, the question,
Go ahead, Ken.
it is a legitimate question, if I remember correctly. When we hear the phrase, my yoke is easy, wasn't someone who was going to be a teacher supposed to go and be trained with another teacher or a priest, and that was called a yoke? That was their yoke or something like that. Actually, in certain ways, this is a very legitimate, who trained you?
Yep, yep.
We're
It is a
doing-
good question.
Yeah, and we,
Yep.
many of us have been confused about, my burden is easy, my yoke is light.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Good comment, Ken. And notice that it specifically points out that it's the priests and Levites. Now make the connection there. Who is John the Baptist's daddy?
Zechariah the priest.
Yeah, who's probably dead by now. But remember in 2 weeks ago lesson, when Zechariah got the several weeks ago, when Zechariah got the announcement of John's birth and even his naming by the angel, he was serving in the temple during his tour of duty in Jerusalem at the temple. And then you remember he is notably mute for the next 9 months, and his voice doesn't return to him until after John the Baptist is born and he's named John. And it's then that Zechariah's mouth is open. And of course, the next statement that's made in the account is that everybody marveled and said, what kind of person is he going to be? They say, this is a lot of interesting stuff around his birth. And so among the priests and the Levites, there was some awareness who this guy was. There's some awareness of little John who grows up. Now we're 30 years later here. But like the story I just told you, that story happened over 40 years ago. People can remember stuff that happened a while back. And some of these priests and leaders, priests and Levites, are probably contemporaries of John the Baptist's dad, Zechariah, younger than him, still living. I mean, just get the idea that it's not like this is a total stranger, but he has not, as many of you pointed out, he has not gone through the system the way that they would have liked or expected him to. Now, I think I saw another hand, because I want to move in just a moment to how John reacts to their question. And as Ken has pointed out, there's a certain legitimacy to it, but there's also a barb to it too. John, you had a comment.
Yes, sir. They were already set up to discredit John the Baptist because they had already discredited Jesus about the information of his birth. And they also appropriate for them to suspect John the Baptist because at age 30, that's when the priests and Levites and people like that usually started their ministry. And they were already told that Jesus the King was born. So they were looking for a person to
Yeah, lots going on here. Lots going on in this story, and it's good to connect the dots and put the pieces together. So this is not just a random group of strangers. These are probably people who know the answer to their question. This is Zechariah's son, John, with this incredible story to his birth and all of that, but he's not playing by our rules. He's not within our box. He's outside our system, and we don't like that. He's threatening our power structure. And who does he think he is? Good comments. Okay, I'm going to switch to John's reaction here in just a moment, but did anybody else want to make any comments, either online or in the classroom, about what's driving these guys who are demanding John to tell them who he is? Please, one more.
Well, I think that everybody was feeling threatened because remember, even the soldiers and the tax collectors, as well as the common people and the Jewish leaders, were all coming out to confront John. Herod was threatened politically. Remember, it was safer to be a pig in Herod's house than to be his own son, which he assassinated.
Right.
Because he thought he was threatening his leadership.
Yep. And let's just land on that for a moment, and then let's switch gears here. And that is true, that if you look at a historian of the day, Josephus is the historian I'm citing, he does comment about Jesus as a historical character, and he does comment about John the Baptist. Interestingly enough, he makes more comments about John the Baptist than he does about Jesus. From a historian's standpoint, he just found John the Baptist very intriguing, and he made more comments about him than Jesus. And John the Baptist was a big deal. And it is true that at this time he was threatening all kinds of power structures, not just the religious power structures, but the political ones, because any Jewish gathering like this that got this much attention was suspect from the Romans. They were suspicious that this could mean an uprising, and that was messy. It cost money, it took time, and if they could cut a uprising off before it got started, they were all for it. So yes, you've got a lot of things going on here, and John is a big deal, and people are paying attention to him. And so these delegates coming out from Jerusalem and asking, who are you? There's a lot going on here. And I've got a comment here online. Let me just read it. These questions were asked publicly, therefore others were listening. What Satan meant for evil, God could use to draw attention to Jesus. Excellent. Yeah. That even though Satan is trying to discredit John the Baptist here, God is going to use this for people to learn more about Jesus, which is exactly where the story is heading. So let's now turn to John the Baptist's reaction.
Doug,
And yes, please.
do you think that there were some really honest people looking for the Messiah and thinking John might have been the Messiah?
I do. Yeah. And I think that they need to be included in this. And probably the best evidence of that is Nicodemus himself. Because Nicodemus is part of this power structure. He's a member of the Sanhedrin, and he's part of this power structure who probably commissioned these guys to go out. And he comes to see Jesus quietly, privately, to have an honest conversation with him. So yes, I would say you're right, Keith. Yeah, good observation. Okay, let's look at John's response. So back to John 1, verse 19. Now this was John's testimony when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, I am not the Christ. And I don't think we're going to linger long on that, because we've already commented on it briefly. And that is that John makes it clear, all these rumors that maybe I'm the Messiah are not true. That's not who I am. And he has said earlier, and he's going to say it again, I'm getting ready. I'm the warm-up act. I'm the bulldozer coming ahead of the Messiah. I have something to do with him, but I'm not him. And he makes that clear. But then these other two might be a little bit more obscure. I want you to notice what's going on here. They asked him, then who are you? Are you Elijah? Now, why would they pick out Elijah? Why would that come to mind? Why not,
Douglas?
somebody else in the Old Testament? Yes, Mother.
He
Yes, please go
certainly
ahead.
resembled Elijah in his temperament,
Yeah.
in his way of living, his dress. And it was promised that the prophet would come in this, like Elijah, before the Christ. And so one other comment I thought of, John the Baptist fit their description of a Messiah more than Jesus did.
Yeah,
so you can see why they thought he might be the Messiah.
Yeah. Thank you, Mother. And let me follow up. Does anybody know? And Mother, I think you know, so let's give somebody else a chance. Does anybody know where that prophecy is that my mother just quoted, saying that John the Baptist, saying that Elijah would come ahead of the Messiah? Anybody know where that's found?
Malachi.
I'm sorry? Say it
Malachi,
again.
chapter of the Old Testament.
Good. Yeah, it's the very last verse in the Old Testament. It's the very last verse in the Old Testament. So it's the way that the Old Testament closes. Thank you, Dwan. And the Old Testament closes with this promise of Elijah coming ahead like a bulldozer. Now, the bulldozer phrase comes more from Isaiah, but Malachi picks up on that and describes this Elijah character coming ahead and preparing for the Messiah. Now, the interesting thing is when they said, are you Elijah? How did he answer? What did he say? What does it say here in verse 21?
I am not.
I'm not. Now, here's where people will sometimes say, oh, there's contradiction in the Bible. We're not going to go there. But in Mark chapter 9, a couple of years later, Jesus is having a discussion with Peter, James, and John, and they're talking about John the Baptist. And he said, John the Baptist was Elijah. Wait a minute. Jesus says he is, John says he isn't. Bible is full of contradictions. How do you make sense of that? Anybody want to give that a try? Oh, Gordon, thank you.
The actual Elijah, he was a metaphorical Elijah.
Okay, not an actual Messiah, metaphorical Elijah. Yeah, Gordon?
Oh, we don't have to know that he knew that he would be Elijah.
Oh, okay, okay. Maybe he didn't know. Okay. Anybody else want to take a shot at that?
He saw,
Dwan, please, Dwan.
he saw his role. He was much more humble than that to claim that position.
Yeah.
In prophecy would have been a little bit of arrogance, and he just saw himself differently.
Yeah.
Not as powerful.
Excellent point. And Dwan, let me build on that, and then let's move on, because really what I want us to see is the spirit here. And you've already opened up that subject by saying there's a humble spirit here. He is not, for all of his boldness, he's not an egomaniac. And I want you to just let that sink in for a second. Sometimes we think that anybody who's bold is full of themselves, is arrogant, is an egomaniac, and he's not. For all of his boldness, he's a man who, by his own words here, what he's going to say later on, he says, the Messiah is coming, and I don't rank to shine his shoes. Now just let that sink in. Here's this guy who's so bold, and he stands up to anybody saying what they need to hear, but he also is not full of himself. And he says, when the Messiah comes, he's going to be a much bigger deal than me. And I don't even rank, I said shine his shoes. That's more modern parlance. What does he say? He says, I'm not even worried to untie his sandals. In their culture, that would be kind of like shining his shoes, but even lower, because that was the thing that a slave did, was to untie and tie your sandals and take care of your feet, wash your feet. And that's going to come up in the foot washing later in Jesus' life. And John is saying, listen, you guys may think I'm a big deal, but I'm nothing compared to Jesus. Now he's going to encapsulate this in a phrase later when his disciples get jealous that Jesus is getting more popular. And you remember the couple of things that John the Baptist is going to say. This is just going to be a few months from now. He says, listen, who do you think I am? I'm not the groom here. I'm the best man. And when you go to a wedding, you're not putting the attention on the best man. You're putting the attention on the groom and the bride. And then he says this famous statement. Remember? He says, and after all, he must increase and I must decrease. I must decrease. Now just let your mind wrap around that John the Baptist's whole attitude in life is saying, as popular as I am, as much of a big deal as I am not the main event. The main event is so much bigger and better than me that when he comes, I wouldn't even dare to stoop down and tend to his sandals. And he needs to keep getting bigger and bigger, and I need to keep getting smaller and smaller. Now, just let your mind wrap around that, because here is humility and boldness, humility and confidence all put together. And sometimes we get it all mixed up. We think that if we are confident, we're also cocky and arrogant and full of ourselves. And that's not what real confidence is all about. And we think that if we're humble, that we must be a doormat that everybody walks over, and who never speaks up, who never says anything worth saying, they just are kind of mumbling under their breath. And we cannot put together this picture of confident and humble bold and yet meek. And Jesus does it best, but John does it pretty good too. And I just want you to stop and think about that, because that's part of what's built into this sense here. And remember, I said this is about self-identity. Who do you think you are? How do you answer that question? And one way that we can answer is say, yeah, I'm kind of a big deal. That's one way, or some variation of that. Or we can go clear to the other extreme and say, oh, I'm nobody. Nobody likes me. I don't have anything to give. And neither one of those is really godliness. They're at two extremes of the spectrum, but they both are misrepresenting who God is and who Jesus is. And we see in Jesus and we see in John the Baptist this incredible blend, this marvelous paradox of somebody who can be humble and confident at the same time and have an identity that knows exactly who he is and who he's not and what he's all about. And at the same time, not be full of himself and arrogant. And I know I'm walking around this. Maybe some of us don't need this lesson, but some of us do. And some of us find ourselves at either end of that continuum, always putting ourselves down, which is another type of being full of yourself, or always being cocky and arrogant and putting other people down, which is another way of being full of yourself. And John was not either. So I want to go on in the response here, but this whole idea of, are you Elijah? He says, I'm not. He does not claim that exalted position for him. And we're not going to turn there, but if you even go back to Luke chapter 1, you'll find that the angel Gabriel himself said he is going to come in the spirit and power of Elijah. So it's not just Jesus who says it later, it's the angel Gabriel who said it earlier before he was born. So there's clearly a tie between John the Baptist and Elijah. The angel prophesied it, Jesus confirmed it. But when somebody comes asking for his credentials, he does not claim that. He says, no, I'm not Elijah. He's not literal Elijah, but he certainly is doing the work that God said he would do in the spirit and power of Elijah. Now, there's one other identity here, and that is, are you the prophet? And he answered, no. Does anybody know there's a historical reference here? And it was a phrase that people used because they understood it. Okay, let's see. We got it. Hang on just a second. We got a comment in the chat. We're looking at the question of awareness of identity. It is interesting to note that twice John said, I did not recognize him except. He must have known Jesus was his cousin, so it was Jesus' identity as the waited for Messiah that John didn't realize until his baptism, ? We criticize the Pharisees for not recognizing Jesus, but even God's prophet didn't recognize him until an appropriate moment. Wow, that is an astute comment. Thank you. And we're working on identity here, and Kathy, thank you for that. That's a great comment. John, you have another one, and then we're going to pull together several comments that are coming up here. Please, John.
Deuteronomy 18:15 states, and this is spoken by Moses, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst. Brethren, him you shall hear.
Yeah. So what do you make of that, John?
I'm sorry? Say again?
What do you make of that? What do you make of that passage?
So Moses was just one of the Jewish people. John is just one of the Jewish people, but he was willing to be molded by God, just like Moses was. And so God rose John up, just like he rose Moses up to lead the people to the Creator.
Excellent. Thank you. Did I miss a hand? Was there somebody else with their hand up? And I want to come back to the comment in the chat here too. But did I miss a hand? Was there a hand up?
I'm in the back.
Please. Oh, Dawn, please. Please, Dawn.
Moses was the guru of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
So when
Yes.
the prophet will come, they're constantly looking for that prophet. So that I think that's kind of behind the motivation behind that question. Are you the one Moses talking about?
Yeah. Excellent. So I see our time is getting away from us. We're near the top of the hour, and I can't believe how our time is flying by. But let's make sure that we are really sinking our teeth into what's come up already in discussion and what we're looking at in the passage here. And I want to take off of your comment, Duan, and then come back to the comment in the chat here. And that is, notice there are three individuals that are all pretty big deals: the Messiah, Elijah, and either Moses or somebody like Moses. And John the Baptist has the opportunity, and just catch this, John the Baptist has the opportunity to say, yep, that's me. He could have said it, yeah, I'm the Christ. Or he could have said, yep, I'm Elijah. Or he could have said, yep, I'm that prophet. Think about what that would have done for his reputation, for his following, for his ministry, what that would have done for the number of crowds coming out to see him. What if he had said yes to any of those identities, which was not true, but people were willing for it to be true? What if he had grabbed onto one of those? And more importantly, not hang on just one second, not so much what would have happened in terms of the movements among the people. What would that have done to John if he had claimed a false identity? Okay, I think Mother, was that you unmuting and making a comment?
That's what I was going to say. What would it have done to him? But also, the truth would out sooner or later. And what would that have done to the mission of Christ? It would have derailed it right there.
Exactly. And wow, there's just so much in this one idea of identity here. Do you realize that when we grab identity that doesn't belong to us, the damage that does? When going back to this idea of being full of ourselves, when we try to prop ourselves up and make ourselves look bigger than we really are, instead of accepting the identity that we are, and I can say the contrast, when we try to make ourselves look smaller than we really are, when we don't accept who we are, who God has made us to be, what God has called us to be, do you realize the damage that can do to God and what he's trying to do through us? And just let this sink in, that John did not grab that and run with it. He said, no, I'm not Elijah, I'm not Moses, I'm not the prophet, I'm not the Messiah. I am somebody, and I know who I am, and I'm going to be that person, and I'm going to be true to that person. And I think the word I'm coming to here is integrity. That when our integrity is compromised, we always do damage to God and what God wants to do through us. And I see a hand in the back. Please, let's take the hand in the back.
On a much broader scale, if we just claim the identity as Christians, and then aren't or don't act like Christians, it's the same problem.
Exactly. And actually, if we were to look at the commandment that some of us kind of breeze by, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. We think, well, I don't use God's name as a cuss word. But do you realize that many of us swear other ways by taking God's name in vain? That we call ourselves as Christians and then we are not. And I'm not talking here about when we stumble and fall. I'm talking about being two-faced, putting on a mask, wanting to fool people, wanting to make people think that we're something that we're not. I'm talking about that. Okay, I just got another comment here on my text. So then, since Satan couldn't intimidate John through challenging questions, then he turned to tempting John by ego, claiming false identity in order to have more power. Wow, you guys are really coming up with some excellent insights here. Good stuff. I'll read that again. So then, since Satan couldn't intimidate John through challenging questions, then he turned to tempting John by ego, claiming a false identity in order to have more power. Wow. Okay, because our time is really rapidly closing and we're not going to even scratch the surface of this story, let's just follow through the ideas that are already on the table. And I want to come to this comment that Kathy made in the chat here. We're looking at the question of awareness of identity. It is interesting to note that twice John said, I did not recognize him, Jesus, except he must have known Jesus was his cousin. So it was Jesus' identity as the waited for Messiah that John didn't realize until his baptism. We criticize the Pharisees for not recognizing Jesus, but even God's prophet didn't recognize him until an appropriate moment. Let's look at that part in this story. So drop down where this happens. This is in article number 27, bottom of the page. And if you are using a Bible that is not edited this way, it's John 1, verse 29. The next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is the one I meant when I said, a man who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. Now just pause here for just a quick bit of trivia that isn't so trivial. How much older, or I should say, who was older of these two men? And by how much?
6 months.
6 months.
Who was older?
John.
John, and he's 6 months older. Yeah. And we know that because of the story of their birth, that Jesus is conceived in Mary's womb when Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant. So there's 6 months age difference. So when John says, he has surpassed me because he was before me, it's a beautiful, almost poetic way of saying, yeah, if you're thinking of a race and one runner surpasses the other, Jesus is born 6 months after John the Baptist. But as John is going to say, he must increase, I must decrease. He's going to surpass me. I'm not even worthy to stoop down and tie his shoes. He's going to surpass me. Hang on just a second, Tiffany, because he was before me. This is an incredible acknowledgement of the pre-existence of Jesus. Jesus existed in heaven before he came to earth. And John is acknowledging that. Now, I'm not going to spend a long time on that. I was noting that in passing, but Tiffany, something came to your mind, comment or question.
Comes to my mind from Deuteronomy 15 all the way to 1 John, divine
I'm sorry, to find what?
divine appointments.
Divine appointment, yeah.
So from Deuteronomy all the way to John, even though there was human will, free will, where we could make, or they could make choices, divine appointment. I mean, it can't be.
Excellent. Yeah. God is putting this together. Good stuff. Thank you, Tiffany. So let's read what he says next. I myself did not know him. And Kathy's comment in the chat, okay, so he didn't know him. Well, they must have known something about each other. So he's probably talking at a deeper level here. I didn't really know who he was. And beautiful things here come to mind. You think of what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5. He says, some of us knew Jesus after the flesh, but he said, that's not the way to know Jesus. We have to know him at a deeper level. And of course, Paul was his own experience when he was Saul, who Jesus was, but he didn't really know who Jesus was. And a lot of us that have grown up in the church or grown up in an environment where we hear about Jesus all the time, we may know who Jesus is, but we don't really know who he is. There's an identity thing there also. And there's something like that going on here apparently with John. He says, I myself did not know him, but the reason I came baptizing with water was that he might be revealed to Israel. And as the bulldozer going ahead of him, at some point he has to know who he's bulldozing for, apparently. And then he says, verse 32, then John gave this testimony, I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him. I would not have known him except that the one who sent me to baptize with water told me, the man on whom you see the Spirit come down and remain is he who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. I have seen and I testify that this is the Son of God. So we've got two ideas here. We've got Jesus' identity and we've got our own identity. In this case, John the Baptist's identity. John the Baptist was clear on his identity, which apparently allowed him to be clear on Jesus' identity. And he could hear God's voice saying, okay, I gave you this sign, and this sign means this. And here he is. Rod, you're going to make a comment.
It's fun to compare Peter's declaration, you're the Son of God, with John's declaration, this is the Son of God, and how much foundation there were under each one of those statements.
Yeah, excellent. Another comment in the margin, 1 Corinthians 13:12, now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I have been fully known. Yeah, this whole idea that we know a little bit right now, but wow, do we have a lot to learn, and we're going to keep learning. And at some point in heaven, we're going to say, we knew nothing. And now we know still next to nothing. We're continuing to learn. And yet we know enough, I think, to be attracted and to say, that's what I want. I want to move in that direction. I want to experience whatever it is that God has for me. I want to be connected to Jesus, even though I don't really understand him, but I want what he has. I want what he has to offer. God is not asking for us to be rocket scientists. Just because there's a lot to learn doesn't mean we have to learn it all before we can start experiencing good stuff. It's a step in that direction that he's asking for. Okay, I got another text here, and I'm going to start wrapping it up here. John must have known Jesus as his cousin. You know, there were family stories about Elizabeth and Mary, but knowing Jesus as God was another idea. Wow, you guys are just really knocking it out of the park today. Good stuff. Okay, let me close with this. I started with a story of myself getting knocked in the face and thrown off of these steps because of this, getting in the middle of this domestic violence situation. And that was the first year that I started pastoring. Let me fast forward about 20 years and tell you another self-identity story. I was pastoring a little church that I had planted along with a small team of people. And to make a very long story short, in the pastoring of that church and the planting of that church, again, doing a lot of door-to-door, by the way, with a little bit different approach this time, we had a little thriving congregation in one of the suburbs of Sacramento that was in some ways going gangbusters. It was growing and doing really pretty well. And I had a colleague who said to me, wow, one day that church is going to be maybe the biggest church in Sacramento. And of course, I had to give an appropriate, humble response, right? That's what pastors are expected to do. So I said, oh no, whatever God wants, or, I forget, I mumbled something that it was supposed to make me sound really humble. But you know what was going on in my head? Yes! That's the way it already looks. And that's what people are going to be saying. They're going to say, and you know who planted that church? Doug Tilstra planted that church. I mean, it was this whole idea of trying to look humble. But in my head, I was as arrogant as could be. Now, again, fast forward. Let me leave out a lot of the story. But things went really sour within about 3 years. Long story short, the church leaders gathered together and asked me to leave. They said, we don't want you anymore here. And I thought, can they do that? I mean, after all, it's one thing if I was invited by somebody to come and pastor a church that already existed, but I planted this church. How can they tell me to get out of here? Now, again, there's a lot here. And I said that I was green and naive in 1979. This happened in 1993. I was still green. I was still pretty green then. A lot I didn't know. Long story short, I did eventually leave. And there was a lot of brokenness, a lot of pain on a lot of sides. And again, I'm not going to finish the story except to say this, is that it's amazing what growth that prompted me into. And what that did for some other people too. It was a painful, painful chapter in my life. and in Lorraine's life. It was painful in a lot of ways. But one of the things that came out of it was some really deep reflection about my identity. And I realized that as good as it can be to do good things like pastoring the church, it can get really twisted too. And it can get a lot about yourself. And I realized that my whole identity was wrapped up in the success of that church. And if the church was doing great and there were new people coming and we had the seats all full, I was a pretty good guy. And if the attendance was down and people weren't as interested in coming anymore, my own sense of how good a person I was going down. That my identity was all wrapped up in how that church was doing. And that's a pretty sick place to have your identity wrapped up. And it gets more complicated and more ugly, but I'll just leave it at that. And in the reflection of that, God brought me to a place where I realized the only real identity that makes any sense for me is what somebody said earlier on. Who am I? I'm God's child. Now I know I have a lot of other identities. I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a professor, I'm an administrator, I'm an uncle, I'm now a grandpa. There's a lot of things I am. But who is my core identity? Who am I? My deepest core? And do I get jerked around when, for example, if my whole identity is that I am a spouse and now my spouse doesn't like me or want me anymore? What does that do to who I am as a person? But there's one identity that can't get jerked around. And that's the identity that I'm a child of God. And God will never jerk me around. Now, he may do some things I don't like or I don't understand, but he doesn't jerk me around. I am his child. And that identity is the bedrock of every other piece of identity of who I am and the roles I play. And as we look at John the Baptist, and we see that he knew exactly who he was and who he was not, that was what laid the foundation for him to know who Jesus was. Because if he would have been saying, yeah, I'm the Messiah, or I'm the prophet, or I'm Elijah, I can bet you he would not have been as clear as saying, now that is the Lamb of God. His vision would have been clouded on who Jesus was because he wasn't sure who he was. So with Ken, let me turn it back over to you.
That was really good. I think you've done this before. Really good. This morning, I was online, and you know how you click on something and then 5 or 10 things on the right side will pop up, an interview with Johnny Carson. So Johnny Carson was sitting there with Billy Graham, so I clicked that. And we're thinking about John the Baptist and evangelizing. In 1973, when this Johnny Carson thing happened, Billy Graham had just come back from Korea. So 1 million people showed up for one sermon. 1 million people. When you think about it, President Eisenhower had been somewhere in 55 and had 800,000 people, and they thought that was 1 million people. You know, evangelizing can be a tricky business, as Doug just told you. What happened to him building the church. Anyway, I really appreciated it, Doug. It was a tremendous lesson today. And remember our motto, we hope that you leave here just a little better than you walked in. No, I did. So Keith Snyder, I think you can have prayer for us, buddy.
Our gracious Father, we thank you again for the chance to delve deeply into the Word. Thank you for Doug and Ken's guidance. Help us to know who we are based on you. And we thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen.
See you next week. We'll let you know who's teaching.